That is what we would call addiction switching. Actually, I don't know that that's like the technical term for it, but it's obviously something that I've experienced in my recovery. And I think that a lot of people experience. And by the way, my name is Vanessa. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date's October 8th, 2017. Addiction switching is something that I wasn't entirely prepared for when I got sober. And it's something that I think I could intellectually talk my way out of, but that I instinctually revert to, regardless of how long I've been sober. And it's kind of crazy to think about because when I first got sober, I just remember being really, I don't know, I was really addicted to the step work, which sounds insane, but I can't even count how many times. I want to say it was like 4 or 5 times that I did the steps back to back before I started sponsoring because people told me I needed to stop doing the steps. But also, I feel like that makes me really qualified to tell you how well the steps work. And actually, I haven't done the steps again since then because I did them so often. Um, and I probably should, to be quite honest. But then after I went through that whole spell, then I got really addicted to helping other people. And I kind of developed this other addiction, which we don't really tend to think about as an addiction, but it's codependency. And I became really reliant upon my relationships with friends, people in recovery, with my parents, with roommates, with men, like all of these relationships, like I was incredibly dependent on having a certain like path, I guess, and that I continue to get something out of it regularly. Well, even if it appeared as selfless as helping other people. And I will revert to this later on in my recovery. But this is like in years 1 and 2, when I got sober, I was like, oh, I gotta like help everybody. I'm gonna go above and beyond. I'm gonna be everybody's hero. And it's just like, okay, that's not actually entirely healthy. And it put me in a lot of positions to be taken advantage of, actually. Um, I was definitely taken advantage of in several situations. And it's because I kept overextending myself and overperforming in these relationships. And then when it didn't turn out as I wanted them to, and this is with family and friends and romantic interests, then I was like, oh, well, that person kind of sucks. Like that person totally took advantage of me. And it's like, well, yeah, I was letting myself be taken advantage of. And so that was a huge eye opener. And then I went on into workaholism, and I became really obsessed with work. And unfortunately, this coincided a lot with the pandemic. And the pandemic actually, because I was working from home, I mean, I was working all day and night. I think I slept maybe 4 or 5 hours some day. And there was something that was like really intoxicating about that still. Like I became really addicted to even like waking up kind of like and being exhausted. Like it reminded me of being hungover. And I honestly don't know how I did that. Clearly, I was like younger back then, but that was only like 4 years ago. But I was extremely disciplined, and I had every minute of my day was super controlled and super maximized for efficiency, and everything external of me, all of my sponsees needs, my sponsors needs, I was leading a workshop at that time, so all of those needs, all of my codependent recovery friends needs, all of my parents needs. I was dating a guy at that point and all of his needs. Um, and of course, all of my work's needs. And I was just going above and beyond, overextending. And it's like codependency is one of those sneaky addictions where people aren't going to tell you to stop because it actually benefits them. I just know that internally I was like, oh, cool, I hadn't showered in 2 days and I can't remember my last full meal. I was eating a lot of cheesecake. I was actually lost a lot of weight because probably I wasn't eating. I was drinking a lot of water. Oh, my dog's needs. I was like super obsessed with my dogs. My dogs actually kept me the most um on like a routine and a schedule for myself because they kind of forced me to go outside and walk them. So that was super helpful. But everything else, is just like it, and I was constantly like anxious, really anxious, and then really depressed, really anxious, really depressed. And of course, exhausted in all of the ways. And it just never felt like anything that I was doing was enough. And then I eased back into codependency friendship. Oh, and by the way, I loved the rush. I was getting so rewarded by the workaholism because I was getting raises. I was getting a lot of recognition. I was getting a lot of appreciation. It was really, I had this sense of like a power that I felt over my life because I had gotten this job that I really felt invested in, and I still work there actually. So I really like the job. But at that time I had like zero boundaries around my because we were a really small company at that time. I had zero boundaries around my time. And I had really no ability to be able to verbalize that like that email's not going to get sent because I need to go to sleep, you know? And in retrospect, like that was really cool because I got to see like how my work environment really fit me. But at the same time, I realized and I could see nobody was expecting that of me, actually. Like I could see nobody asked me to stay until 2 or 3 in the morning, you know, and wake up really early and get to do it all over again. It definitely benefited the company, and I don't regret doing any of it. Actually, I had a lot of fun in this weird way because I was kind of like getting so deeply entrenched in this new company that was just, we were just getting off the ground. But a lot of that came from, I need to prove myself. I need to show them that I'm worth it because they kept giving me pay increases for like all of the work that I was doing. And I was like, I'm gonna work even harder, you know, and I really was benefiting from that. And then, you know, and then people started dying. You know, I had 3 sponsees die. I had 2 cousins die, pretty young cousins who died much earlier than I would have anticipated them dying ever. And I had a writing mentor die, and former sober living roommates die. And so on and on, all these people were starting to die. And this all happened within like 12 to like 12 to like 18 months. It all happened. And like one by one, I was getting like, it was like chipping away at my like willpower, this like internal motivation that I had to outperform to show my worthiness. And it like every death that kind of like happened, basically ended up like weakening me a little bit, you know, and I became a little less trusting of God with each one. And especially people who died who I knew from the program, because I was like, and then my friends, some of my best friends began to relapse who'd had double-digit recovery, you know, and I was like, what am I doing here? I've invested the last 4 years of my life to this program of recovery, and I'm seeing it fail left and right, you know? And why am I doing all the things? And I feel so miserable inside. I felt so anxious and I felt so resentful and I felt really suspicious about everybody and everything. And then I began to latch on to really unhealthy people because they gave me attention that I thought I needed at the time. All I needed was somebody to validate my existence that was outside of the recovery community. And honestly, I feel like I needed to get outside of the recovery community for a bit because I was just like, all of this seems really fake. I just lost a bunch of people in the course of 12 months. How is it possible that this program works? What I had failed to see during that time is, because I did keep sponsoring, by the way, is that, I mean, I was staying sober, right? Physically sober. Emotionally sober, I feel like I was really and I got into a really entrenched in this really unhealthy codependent relationship with, I know that the narcissist word is like thrown around a lot, but in retrospect, there were clear signs that this guy was a narcissist. And I remember talking about him to my friends, and at first, like we had kind of met as like romantic interests or whatever, and we'd gone on dates, and then he ended up developing some like health issues. And then I got really concerned and just kind of like latched on because I was like, oh no, here's one more person who's going to die. And I feel like I was like subconsciously using this person to right all of the wrongs from all of the, incomplete closed loops from the people who I had lost previously, because it seems like, oh, if I had just answered that last sponsee's call, if I had just replied to the other sponsee's text, if I had just, called that cousin one more time, maybe things could have been different. And clearly that's a delusion, right? But it also comes from this fear of not being enough, not having control, the unknown, being out of control. And so then here I had a specimen of a person who's going through a pretty drastic and chronic health condition. And, they had really, in retrospect, manipulated the situation so that they could guilt me into doing all these things for them. And had I had better boundaries, had I not been so emotionally unwell, had I not been looking for a distraction outside of myself, I wouldn't have preoccupied myself with this person so much. It kind of makes me sad for 2021 me in 22 for for searching for that like distraction in other people. And, clearly he's a sick person, much like myself, in a lot of ways, not just physically. And it's been interesting to see him repeat this pattern over and over again with other people. But in addition to that, it just kind of taught me that like, oh, but I am the one who participated in that dynamic. Right. So we could blame him for being a narcissist all we want, but I'm still the one who engaged in that despite the red flags, but despite the consistent lying, crazy made up stories, all the things to show me that the hurt feelings, the like very blatant manipulation that was happening. I still continued to betray myself and run past those red flags and be like, oh, but I just don't want to leave anything so that if he died from this health condition, I don't want to have any more regrets that maybe I should have been there for this person, right? And then in around 2000, in 2023 is really when and then in 2020, oh, and I forgot an early sobriety too. Not early, it's in 2017, 2018, when I had also just recently gotten sober. I was relying a lot on food. Part of that was because I was on psych meds and I had this really unsettling and like insatiable hunger. Like I just had to be like, I felt so like physically and emotionally and spiritually empty that I was like stuffing my face with like everything that I could find. And I mean, I remember going to uh Overeaters Anonymous at that point. And it was just still like a BBA. One of my friends was actually leading this workshop on it. And I got partnered up with somebody else. And like, I was like, oh my God, it's so crazy, like how common this is. Like we would just go from like drive-through to drive-through to drive-through. And like the majority of the girls in there, you wouldn't even know. And men also have this, by the way, absolutely. Because I have seen it in other men and they're very verbal about it, which I'm grateful for. And to see just like this psychotic behavior, it's like this compulsion and it's just like must eat, must eat, must eat. And sometimes it's the purging is involved too, and then going through cycles of over exercising, and then going through cycles of complete restriction, eating like no more than like 500, 800 calories a day, drinking a lot of water, over exercising, not understanding why I felt so anxious all the time, and then completely binging and just overeating everything, anything that's bad and like toxic for you, and all the chemicals and terrible, right? And I kind of eased out of that 2019, 2020. And then I got into the workaholism and then the codependency. And then 2022, 2023, 2022 I had like a strange experience where I got really like I don't even know how to express what this is. I don't know how common of an addiction switch this is, but I got really involved with the comedy community. I think that we can I feel like with all of these things, it became my identity, right? And so, for example, like, with the workaholism, like I just knew that like, okay, I'm a hard worker. Like this is now my identity. With that friend, I'm like, I am the best friend who's gonna help this guy with his chronic health condition, you know? Um, and then with the recovery stuff, like I am Miss AA princess. I'm gonna speak at all these things and inspire all these people and sponsor all the women and save all the lives, right? And then I became this like comedy community person in San Diego, which is such a random thing. But all it was another distraction to separate myself from the grief that I didn't want to process, and from that friendship, that really toxic codependent friendship that was based on my fear of this person dying, and not even of that person dying, but of everybody who came before him who died, and how I had left those relationships. And it, and then that was like a weird, and that was like a double-edged sword, because I ended up, the codependency with a community was a new thing that I hadn't really experienced. It was really strange, because now there were comics who kind of relying on a platform that I was building to like help promote them. And there came a point where it stopped being a distraction for me. It became something I wanted to be distracted from. And so I had gone through like a few months of like flirting with this idea. And I had kind of like a checklist of things that I wanted to like do. I wanted to produce a show. I wanted to go to certain clubs. I wanted to do this, that, blah, blah, blah. And that was super fun. All of it was cool. But there came a point where I was like, this is not just, this is reminding me of all the problems I had. And especially because a lot of the people in the comedy community are really similar to people in the recovery community, except the people in the recovery community know that they have a problem. The people in the comedy community, they can joke about knowing about what the problem is, but they don't actually, and nor are they actually willing to get any help for it. So then I was really spinning my wheels, and that was just even more triggering for me, because I'm like, wow, these people might die. They're not coming to me for help, and I can't help them. So I shut down that whole thing. I was like, I'm done, not participating in this anymore. And then recently, and then I had this whole idea of like, I'm gonna become a workaholic again. I changed jobs, I moved, I did the whole thing that any addict and alcoholic does. They become so fascinated with like these quick fixes, these compulsions, these impulsive decisions, that like, oh, okay, now I'm gonna change my life and start over, and things are gonna be different this time. But what I still wasn't facing was this very internal dis-ease within me, that I wasn't treating with maybe alcohol and drugs anymore, but I sure was treating with everything else outside of me again. And guess what? It didn't work, because then I ended up moving to doing this other job, and I was like, none of this is what I want. I had what I wanted when I lived in San Diego. I just had myself inside of me that I couldn't talk through. I couldn't make peace with. I couldn't make peace with all this grief and this guilt and this overall feeling that like I wasn't doing enough. And so I was like, all right, well, reevaluate some of my decisions that I made. And that's kind of when I moved back to San Diego. All of these are very expensive choices and decisions that I've had to make. There's been some sacrifice, there's been some uneasy conversations that I've had to have, and some relationships that I had to cut off, right? Like I haven't talked to my parents since then. Um, and I recently have started to find myself really obsessive with weight again. And I could say that like the weight itself has never been the actual obsession. But I have definitely started to show signs again of disordered eating. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I've actually never been diagnosed with an eating disorder, but I can tell by the way that and I just want to say I have disordered eating. I'm not diagnosed with anything like that. And I feel myself, like I know that like gnawing inside of me where I'm like, this is gonna fix it. And usually it starts with like sugar. I used to be on like a pretty strict like meal plan, mostly to manage my a couple of things. One, to manage because I do have like an autoimmune thing, and so some foods do trigger that, and I get a lot of inflammation and pain, and um it kind of it gives me migraines. It can affect me really physically if I don't watch what I eat. Um, and also for when I had my bipolar 2 disorder diagnosis, I found that certain foods, certain eating habits really trigger the mania and the depression and the swinging of it. And I would try to continue medicating with caffeines and sugars and carbs. And so that got really hectic for a while too. And then more recently, I'm like, oh, actually, this isn't making me feel good. And so then I'll overeat or restrict, and then I'll become really obsessive about like, oh, maybe I want to look at, and it's weird to say that it truly, I think the weight is just like a metric of my eating patterns, whereas the actual obsession is with the pattern of eating. So it's like being able to have control over anything, right? And so while I can like look at that and intellectualize it, I'm actually having to do a lot of work right now in introspection, and I'm working more with like the shadow side of what I'm going through instead of doing more resentment sheets. I kind of want to like go through this avenue and see like what's beneath this right now that I'm experiencing. There are other things that I've experienced addiction with that I kind of feel I don't want to necessarily I feel awkward talking about because it does involve other people, right? So like sex and love addiction can be a thing. Again, I don't actually think that I would meet the categories for these, but I do tend to use people as a distraction for myself and what's going on within me. So I'll go through phases of just like normal whatever, and then I'll go through phases of, what would be interesting is to engage in something that I know is not going to go anywhere, just so I can distract myself from my own life momentarily. Probably there's some amends that need to be made around that. So maybe that's contributing to part of it. But I can tell you that any of that, any actions that I take that are, not hinged on like the purity of motivation, has some like weird underlying motivations beneath it, or that is dishonest, or that is selfish, and that isn't based in love, will always come back to me. So it's really important that I be clear and that I try not to act out in things. And I also realized that I was holding on to a lot of relationships that just didn't serve me anymore, and that really didn't serve the other person either. And I kind of held on to these relationships out of guilt, again, because I do have a lot of trauma around losing people. But I feel like I'm kind of having a different understanding about death, and I don't want to talk about it in this one because it's kind of weird and spiritual, and I'll talk about it in a different video. The codependency around like reliance on food as a drug is still kind of there. And I think I want to share about it from this perspective while I'm still in it, while I'm still in like the messy middle of this process, because it kind of holds me a little bit more accountable. And I don't ever want to feel like just because I'm sober, I have from drugs and alcohol, that I have all the answers and that I'm living this, perfectly angelic and like saintshood of a life. Because I do feel like a lot of addicts and alcoholics get sober from the drugs and alcohol that brought them to the rooms, and then they begin to addiction switch, and they're still not understanding why they're feeling so miserable. And then they inevitably, because they don't realize that they've been addicted to these other things the way that they were addicted to drugs and alcohol, they can't. And so in their minds, they're kind of like justifying it, like, well, everything must just be bad then. And it's like, no, you're just still addicted to stuff outside of yourself for this ease and comfort. When that's not it, and it's like, again, I can intellectually know this, but my body and my behavior will default into this. I just happen to know that drugs and alcohol are not an option for me anymore. And there's nothing in me that is wanting that at all. The same way that there's nothing in me that's wanting to become a workaholic right now. Because right now my addiction, or be obsessed with anyone right now, or seek sex and love from anyone right now, because my primary addiction right now is with the controlling of like calories, or the losing of control over calories, which is the same cycles of like oblivion, right, that I used to enjoy when I was drinking. Because it was like, I know I can have one glass or I can have 30, and I know that it'll like take me somewhere that it's not here, right? It's a dissociation with myself. So I'm saying that to say that I'm doing some work at the moment with what is underneath it all right now. I know it's gonna be something so freaking obvious and annoying. Hi, this is editing Vanessa, and I don't know why it was so hard for me to say that I'm struggling with my relationship with God. I need to work on my relationship with God. That's what I'm trying to get down to. Okay, thanks. But again, just putting that out there in case you are sober and you're finding yourself switching addictions to being like, oh, okay, maybe now is the time. Oh, video games is another thing that guys tend to do a lot. Gambling is another one. Shopping is another one. Oh yeah, I forgot that during the whole pandemic, I was like totally, I know a lot of people were shopping a lot. I think I was shopping, I got myself into tremendous amounts of debt because of it. And so it's like, cool, that maybe, you know, some of those things don't go away. Like we still need to handle the repercussions of them when we come out of that addiction, right? But just putting it out there in case you find yourself miserable, but you're not doing the drugs and alcohol, and you're like, why am I so miserable? Well, let's check and see if you're being addicted to anything else, anyone else. And then see if there's something underneath that you're hiding from yourself, or if there's an amends that you have to make, or if there's a resentment that you're not wanting to look at, if there's a change in your life that you want to make, but you're too, but you're in fear of making it, you know? Okay, I love you guys. Bye.